November 30th, 2022 was the moment that would catapult artificial intelligence into the mainstream.
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT opened a Pandora's box on artificial intelligence. Well, at least the learning language model component. The history of AI obviously goes further back. The 1956 Dartmouth Conference is often cited as the birthplace of AI, where the term artificial intelligence was coined and its goals and challenges from an academic standpoint were laid out. Now, prior to that, the famous Alan Turing wrote the paper Computing Machinery Intelligence, where he proposed the Turing test, a practical criteria for determining whether a machine could exhibit intelligent behavior indistinguishable from humans. Now, the breakthroughs in machine learning, neural networks, and computational power in the late 20th and early 21st centuries would propel AI into its current form of rapid advancement and widespread application. Now, in all its glory, taking inputs from simple prompts and then outputting elegant human-like responses, we forget that there is a vast array of machines, network connections, and even humans to a certain extent, making it all work. And in the midst of all this happening behind the scenes, the how of AI development, in my opinion, is not part of the greater AI conversation. Now, while I do believe that there is much to be celebrated about AI, let me paint the current scene and share an interesting conversation I had with Dan Stanley, Executive Director of Future Narratives. Now, Future Narratives is a nonprofit initiative specializing in narrative analysis and research. They are a fascinating organization, and I've included their link in the description for you to check them out. So Dan was commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to write an article about what we don't talk about when we talk about AI. In essence, there are two sides dominating the AI conversation right now. One about the positive outlook and opportunities that AI is unlocking, and the other that's a little bit more dystopian.
The dominant narratives of AI at the moment they're very dramatic, and they're very much based around these big stories that kind of recur, and these sort of patterns and models of stories that recur in our culture and are obviously very fascinating to us to sort of retell these stories over and over. Obviously that comes from somewhere because it kind of predates the current fascination with it based on like the developments that have happened in the last few years. That's something that we kept telling and retelling, and it even goes back, way into sort of antiquity, that we would tell stories about sort of robots and golems and things of different types. So it's not really a new thing at all. But yeah, you can see that now that's sort of set the stage for us now to be the way that we think about this topic. And I think then from that basis, the debate has evolved in certain directions. What's interesting, particularly from our point of view, is like the way we think about narrative is, it's an ongoing challenge, is that is obviously understood in a kind of colloquial sense. The most commonly understood term is story, essentially. It's a term where you're talking about the structure of a story. And in the case of AI, obviously, like you say, the most common types of narrative, even when you're thinking about it in a wider sense, are dramatic ones. One of the things at the beginning of the article I try to clarify, if I can, a little bit, is to say these may be the types of narrative that are particularly influential when it comes to AI, but actually narrative in general, we understand to mean like all of our ways of thinking, essentially, and the structures of those. But certainly in the case of AI, you can see very directly that we are, despite it being this kind of very technical scientific subject, we're being influenced very heavily by kind of mythical, dramatic stories, essentially. And the example that I give in the article at the beginning is Joe Biden's chief of staff. He came out in October and talking about the executive order on AI that was signed around that time, and said that this had been in part informed, or at least motivated, by the president watching Mission Impossible 7. I think it's 7. Of course, that film has, if you haven't seen it at the beginning, that there is a rogue AI called the Entity that takes over a submarine and is essentially the protagonist, or the antagonist, I should say. Antagonist in that film. Protagonist maybe comes later. But
well, it depends on whose side. For the AI, that it would be the protagonist, right?
Some people watching actually were, supporting the AI. Some people have that point of view, but so he said essentially, look, I think he said something like, if he wasn't already concerned about this after watching that film, he certainly was. And so he kind of readily admitted that was part of the thinking. And I think that that illustrates that even at that level of decision making, it's a bit of a throwaway comment maybe, but I think the reality is, if you look at the debates and you look at what is in the headlines and you look at what people tend to focus on, it has been massively shaped, I think, by the fact that the instinctive reaction to thoughts about robots and AI is robot takeover, Terminator, AI apocalypse,
Hmm.
obsolescence. But if you look across many of the most influential people in a number of AI companies or investors or in the sort of technology world generally, it's actually quite a common set of beliefs. But they're quite extreme, and they do come to quite extreme conclusions. And effective altruism, for instance, might be familiar with, like Sam Bankman-Fried and the collapse of
FTX. Yeah.
FTX. Yeah, exactly. And people like William McCaskill and others like that, who are kind of part of that world. And obviously, there are different variations of effective altruism that come to different conclusions. But one of the ways of thinking associated with that is that we should be sort of calculating what we do now based on all of the people that might exist in the future, and then kind of working back and saying, well, what we do now, then obviously they're more important by numbers than we are as individuals now, because there'll be far more of them, or there might not be if we don't do the right things, and therefore we have to kind of
Right.
prioritize our behaviors here. And you can see how that connects through to ideas about future risks and existential risk. If we create a super intelligent AI now and it benefits us for 10 years and then destroys the world, well, that's quite bad for all the people who would have come around after 10
Yeah.
years. Might be good for us in the short term, or for those of us who are around for those 10 years. But if you're making that kind of a calculation, then you obviously think, okay, we need to think about whatever the benefits, we need to think about existential risk from AI as a priority. And sometimes that can lead to very different conclusions, because there are some people who despite this will say, well, AI has the potential to take us into space and do all these other things that they believe are coming, and so therefore we should accelerate it, and push forward. And then there are others at the other end of the spectrum who will say things like, we should be ready to do airstrikes on data centers, now,
Right.
to stop AI, arriving or being developed in secret, or so on.
Now that we have the scene drawn, the first thing that is going to get some attention, but probably not enough, is the actual regulation of AI. When something so impactful such as AI is introduced into society, governments and lawmakers are often forced to catch up with regulation. But why regulate? Well, it comes down to the need to protect the public from potential harm. This is usually the driver of regulation. Now, hidden political agendas aside, we see this all the time. Cryptocurrency is a recent example, and financial regulation is another if you go back to the Great Recession of 2007. Who determines that policy when we have these extreme narratives that are out there right now? And, we look at the financial industry and say, well, they created, some self-regulating organizations to keep their members in check when it comes to the financial industry. And one can argue that, during 2007, 2008, that was a huge debacle and, lack of regulation within a self-regulating entity, and more political and public committees need to be created to govern financial. So I think you kind of see where I'm going with AI, is that, who determines these policies now when we do have these narratives propping up seemingly extreme sides.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, in the sense that I think one way you can look at the narratives that have been deployed publicly, or kind of reinforced publicly over the last few years by these companies and by others, investors and others, I think is as an effort to determine whose voice should be heard and not. Because the assumptions, the kind of common ground, unspoken common ground of these more fantastical kind of long-term existential risks, or indeed the kind of more positive ones, or many of the other kind of ways in which these debates have been framed, is this is super important stuff. It's super complicated and technical. It's urgent. Therefore, we need to quickly defer to the expertise of these people who know a lot about this. They're the ones who we should ask. The results of that, you see these kind of congressional hearings and other things where CEOs turn up, and then all of the senators go, well, what should we do? Tell us. We wish, even say things like, we wish you would just tell us what the regulation should be and so on. And like, it shows the success of that kind of framing of things as being the technology as being something where there's a kind of a right answer that only experts can take us to, which I think is, and in some ways this is like a completely novel thing in the way that like the narratives are very novel in their kind of deployment, at least, if not their origin. Actually, there's some really familiar stuff there around how, if you look at how other times when new technology has kind of come through, or at least when I think there's been like a question over regulation, actually some of these arguments are very similar in form to the kind of arguments that are made against regulation from a sort of financial sector or whether it's other sectors.
Yep.
In that there would be this thing of, okay, we should listen to the CEOs who know about this stuff. It's all super complicated. It's not about a balancing of powers and of benefits and of like democratic debate and kind of like contesting. It's about technical expertise and what the right answer is. And I think that is something we've seen across the economy and in some ways across politics for the last, few decades, really, of a sort of technocratic conception of how we should be doing politics, that we, it's not really for the normal people or like the popular involvement to determine who benefits from things happening. It's more a question of like optimization by experts. And that obviously favors the experts very much, right? And who are the experts?
Of course.
They pick themselves as experts because they run the companies, and therefore you can see that there won't be they can therefore have a lot of influence over making sure that the kind of regulation that might undermine their business models doesn't happen. And in the case of AI, I think, there's some interesting kind of specific pieces of regulation, I think, that are kind of particularly threatening to them, that they're keen to avoid. And connecting it back to the ideological point, I think you can see they definitely see themselves, and explicitly have said this, Sam Altman and others, that, they have this role to do AI right, get it to the point that where it's like artificial general intelligence, this super intelligence thing is arriving, and they are the right ones to do it. And it can't really be done by anyone else. If anyone else does it or the government tries to stop it, that will only cause more problems. And so almost anything is justified then, in the sense that it's like they need to make sure nothing gets in the way of their view of how it happens. And so that, I think, has then led to this effort, more or less consciously, to say, you must listen to us about how this works, and we will have lots of voluntary regulatory kind of agreements, but stay away from thinking about the things that are really part of our core business model and allow us to really operate in the way that we are.
Now, I talked earlier about behind the scenes of AI, from the computer servers to networks around the world. So let's talk about the environmental impacts of AI. These facilities themselves, which consist of data centers and servers, require immense amounts of energy to process and analyze vast data sets, a fundamental process in training AI algorithms. As an example, training state-of-the-art AI model like OpenAI's GPT-3 with its 175 billion parameters can consume an estimated 1,300 megawatts of electricity. Now, to put this into perspective, the average US household consumes about 10 megawatt hours of electricity for the entire year. Now, of course, that's just GPT-3, and with GPT-4, the demands are even more. And here lies the vicious cycle. The more AI develops, the more energy it needs to process that information. Here's a crazy stat too, and one that affects natural resource before AI even runs: fresh water. Fab facilities, which are the manufacturing facilities that make semiconductor chips, require a substantial amount of ultra-pure water, ranging from 2 to 4 million gallons per day. So let's think about this. Creating an integrated circuit on a 30-centimeter wafer can require approximately 2,200 gallons of water. Back in 2015, Intel reported that it used approximately 9 billion gallons of water that year, and that was back in 2015, before the current ramp-up of AI semiconductor chips. And again, to bring this into some perspective, we as humans in North America use about 80 to 100 gallons of water per day. So regulation and environmental impact are not fully discussed in today's AI conversation. And the last one that I'm going to cover is about data. So in 2014, Meta, or Facebook at that time, paid $19 billion for the messaging app WhatsApp. Now, one would ponder why Facebook would pay so much money for an app that at that time barely generated any revenues, until this day seemingly generates minuscule amounts of revenue compared to what Facebook paid for it at that time. Now, ultimately, the answer comes down to data, our personal data. Now, think about the number of messages that go back and forth daily on the WhatsApp app. With access to this data, a company can create a tremendous amount of insights and sellable information about societal trends, purchase intent, and so on. It's like having a crystal ball in your hands. This is super valuable data. But what about data when it comes to AI? Well, Dan frames it as a datafication of our society.
The basic concept is really just that AI, although it's presented as being like the trend, like the big thing we should be thinking about, you can actually kind of zoom out from that and see it more of a kind of a symptom of something that's been going on for quite a while. You can go back a long time to talk about this, but particularly over the last sort of couple of decades, I think you see, and it is a trend towards, as things become digitized and become more easily measurable, we get to the point where we are kind of measuring everything, and there are sensors everywhere, and people's every kind of behavior and interaction is kind of tracked and measured and recorded. And then you get to the point where people have found that this creates a new source of value, right? That you can utilize that data and make money from it. And therefore that drives more and more measurement and more surveillance and more of the kind of the effort to create and mine data from everything that's happening. And that can be in a kind of business sense, it can be in public behavior and communication and purchasing patterns. Obviously a lot of it has come out of, I think that the kind of one of the biggest drivers of it has been advertising and social media. This one
Right.
really took off as the sort of and it's the kind of model, I think, that sort of is the engine of it is, we will give you free services if you come on our platform and let us track you and then sell that data, i.e. to advertisers to target you, but also, for lots of other purposes, including now, as we're seeing, for training of AI. That kind of datafying of all of our behavior is something that is increasing and accelerating. And you're seeing, across all sorts of different sectors and different areas of life, the drive to measure, the drive to record, the drive then to extract value from that data, to the extent that sort of behaviors and things are being influenced by that very need for them to be measurable in order to be valued.
In training AI, operators are feeding it huge amounts of data, and inevitably this is going to cross some lines. There are various lawsuits underway, actually, where copyright infringement is being argued. In December, the New York Times sued OpenAI and Microsoft for copyright infringement, claiming that OpenAI and other platforms were fed millions of New York Times articles to train the platforms, which are now competing with the news outlets as source of reliable information. Now, this lawsuit is opening a new front in the increasingly intense legal battle over unauthorized use of published work to train artificial intelligence technologies. But aside from copyright work and drawings by artists, the fundamental notion of our personal data now being scraped and utilized for whatever AI purposes is a bit unsettling. But as Dan has mentioned, we are in the datafication world where companies have normalized the collection and use of personalized data.
There has been a reinforcing of this, I think, relatively natural and instinctive understanding of data as something that just is a possession that belongs to us, like an individual thing, like your data, my data. I have data, right? Like I produce data, it belongs to me, it's about me. What I want to do is stop someone else from getting my data, or maybe sell my data to a company who will give me something for it or exchange it in order to get free whatever, right? Not many of us think about data that much, but where we do, those are the sort of common ways of thinking about it that there are. There has been a big effort over the last few decades, or I should say the last decade in particular, actually, to make sure that those are the ways that we're thinking about it in this baseline individualistic way, where it's something that belongs to me as a possession, and I therefore should be protecting from other people primarily, or that I should be exploiting for my own personal benefit. Now, the reality is, which is becoming more and more clear and more the case over time, is that data in general is, and especially valuable data, is about connections between people. It's about groups. It's not really ever or rarely, you'd say. I mean, in some cases, you could say it is individual, but even then, it's borderline in a lot of cases. But it's rarely about one person, and any sort of data set of any quantity, you can infer things about all sorts of people that aren't in it and about the connections with others. And the companies kind of know this. So in a way, they don't need individual level data. They're quite comfortable with the idea of people continuing to think about data on an individual basis, whether that's in a positive sense of trading their data individually, but also in the negative sense of protecting personal privacy. That is a non-challenging way for people to be kind of responding to worries about technology. So you'll see a lot of the big social media companies over the last, and others, including people like Apple and other technology companies, have directly promoted the idea of personal privacy. They'll say things like, you are in control of your privacy. You need to look after it. You should make the decisions. It's all about you. It's very, very much kind of putting the responsibility on the user to be responding to problems with tech, which obviously then undermines any idea that this might be a collective problem where you can't respond on an individual level, and that you need to be thinking about this as something which is, things that belong between us, to all of us, and that which lots of things do. When we think about things like clean air, think about water, we think about our environment, lots of other things. It doesn't make sense to just say, look after your own bit. It doesn't work.
We all breathe the same air. Yeah.
But that is the fundamental model that we're encouraged to think through around data. That basically allows for these big companies to exploit the collective space of data, and sort of seize value from it, essentially, as much as they want, because we don't have a common collective nature of data. We've never thought about it in that sense in any meaningful way.
What's also interesting is that data is limited. While vast in quantity, human data knowledge collectively is limited. So what happens when operators run out of data to actually feed the AI programs?
They have this idea of synthetic data, where you kind of invent data using AI that we then feed back into the AI using in part existing data. But there has been some evidence that if you do too much of that, of course, you're sort of feeding on your own fumes, and then the models collapse quite quickly into nonsense, because the smallest error is then sort of replicated and amplified. That's going to be an increasing point of contention over the next few years, I think, is like, where does more data come from that they need to train these? And also, I think, obviously, as well, the historical question of like, well, a lot of these platforms were trained on data in incredibly sketchy ways, because there's no rules, right? Because there wasn't ever before wanted to go out and like harvest up everybody, all the data on the internet, and feed it into a program. It was like an absurd idea. There would be no point in that. But now, obviously, that is the basic model of how you train things. And so, there's this kind of mad scramble for more and more data, and we'll see how that plays out.
So what's the solution here? From a regulatory viewpoint, I would say that the growth and surge in popularity of recent AI tools is really helping to actually bring these issues to the forefront, which this may help steer the narrative in the right direction.
So in some ways, AI, like the current type of AI, because it's so data hungry, because it relies on data so much, that has forced them into behaviors which bring the kind of this issue to the forefront a little bit. Some of the kind of ways in which things have been totally scraped and sort of copyright, and the fact that people are seeing like, okay, well, you've just used everybody's output to create a system which benefits just you. It's like there's something's kind of wrong there, right? Like that's fundamentally something that we don't think is fair. So I think you can see how you could start to build a case for a kind of constructive response to that.
When it comes to environmental impact, fab facilities are definitely starting to take some action. Intel has set ambitious goals to achieve net positive water usage, 100% renewable energy across its global operations, and net zero greenhouse gases by 2040. They are investing in water restoration projects, conserving billions of gallons of water, and implementing something called circular economy strategies, which will help manage waste better. Taiwan Semiconductor has said they're committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050, emphasizing low carbon manufacturing, renewable energy use, and increased energy efficiency. Now, when it comes to personal data, as Dan puts it, we need to look at it in a different way rather than individualized privacy. And in addition to all this, Web3 technologies are emerging that might allow us as individuals own our own data and be able to reap some of those monetary benefits from the current corporations that are getting actually 100% of it. Think about getting a piece of pie, however big or small it is, but knowing that at least that digital data is yours to own and not to the whim of some third-party company. So what are your thoughts about what isn't being talked about AI? Leave your thoughts below in the comments, and I want to carry on more of this conversation outside of this video. And with that, thank you for watching this episode. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening to this episode on a podcast platform, make sure you hit the follow button and leave a comment if you can. Every little bit helps. Take care, and I will catch you in the next episode.